To be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, a service member must distinguish himself conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while engaged in an action against an enemy of the United States, or while engaged in military operations involving conflict with opposing foreign forces. Now, contrary to popular belief, 1 in 6 Medal of Honor recipients are awarded it posthumously. The other 5 probably all wondered how they survived that ordeal. Now, the criteria today is different from when it was first proposed. The original criteria, proposed by Senator James Grimes of Iowa as chairman of the Committee on Naval Affairs, Grimes proposed a Naval Service Award that became the model for the Medal of Honor. Now, this was established by Congress in 1863. Now, it's presented by the President in the name of Congress. The Medal of Honor recognizes just non-commissioned officers and privates as shall most distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action and other soldier-like qualities. So with this earlier criteria for the Medal of Honor established, this is the story of the 52 Medal of Honor awards earned by the cable cutters of Cienfuegos Bay during the Spanish-American War. The U.S. declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898. Now, the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba began April 21st. By early May, the effectiveness of the blockade had cut Cuba off from the rest of the world, except for communications. Now, the telegraph lines that connected Cuba with the outside world were still operating. Now, the Navy was given the objective to cut the cable lines into Cuba. Now, there was a cable line on the north coast that went to Key West. We didn't care about that. But the south coast, the telegraph cables are looped along the shore from Batabano, a port about 30 miles nearly due south of Havana, and connected with that city by railroad and overland telegraph. Now to the eastward, as far as Guantanamo Bay, the northern loops of the cable touching San Luis and Cienfuegos, and then Trinidad, Santiago de Cuba, and a point on the shore of Guantanamo Bay. By cutting the cables at Cienfuegos, the island of Cuba was completely cut off from the rest of the world. Okay, so the U.S. Fleet 4th Division was assigned that task of cutting the cables. This force consisted of the cruiser Marblehead, the gunboat Nashville, the converted yacht Eagle, and the revenue cutter Wyndham, and the collier Saturn. Now, Commander B.H. McCullough of the Marblehead was the overall commander of the operation. Commander McCullough's division was standing off of Cienfuegos on the early evening of May 10th. McCullough sent a signal to the gunboat Nashville requesting Commander Washburn Maynard and Lieutenant Winslow to report aboard the Marblehead for a conference. Now, arriving on board the Marblehead, the two officers were informed by McCullough of the plan to cut the cables. In Lieutenant Winslow's article, Cutting the Cables at Cienfuegos, May 11, 1898, in the Century Magazine issue, Volume 57, Issue 5, explained his orders from McCullough. I was to command an expedition of boats to find and cut the cables landing near the Colorado Lighthouse. Now, that expedition would be opposed by a force of the enemy, and that the Marblehead and the Nashville would shell the country and attempt to dislodge the enemy or silence his fire. I was also told that I could have a steam cutter and the sailing launch of the Marblehead and the steam cutter and sailing launch of the Nashville. He was also informed that Lieutenant E.A. Anderson of the Marblehead would accompany the expedition as his second command. And then he had no further orders as to the regard of fitting out the expedition, the details being left entirely to Winslow's own judgment. So McCullough and the 4 officers then went onto the bridge and carefully examined the shoreline and the country about the cable house. Now, the Marblehead was close enough to shore to see, with the aid of binoculars obviously, the rifle pits and the soldiers working about them, as well as those on duty at the signal station. The one thing that was unknown was the placement of any field artillery. Now, if the Spaniards had any artillery, they would have camouflaged them. After surveying the defenses, Lieutenant Winslow and Lieutenant Anderson, the second in command, as I said, of the operation, developed their plan of attack, such as it was. You see, there were some major flaws in this plan. First of all, the proximity of the shore party boats to the Spanish defenders. In some cases, the boats were only a length or two from the shoreline itself. When I say shore, what I mean is the cliffs along the coastline. Now, retrieving a cable from the ocean floor is not a simple task, even under the best of conditions and with the right equipment. Unfortunately here, Lieutenant Winslow and his men had to make do with what they had, which was 2 sailing launches rowed by 16 men, grappling hooks and rope, cold chisels, blacksmith's hammers, a heavy maul, a block of hardwood with an iron plate for its upper surface, an axe, wire cutting pliers, and a hacksaw. And this was not the best of conditions, as I said. The cable weighed 6 pounds to the linear foot, and they could not just cut the cable and call it a day. They had to take out large sections of each cable in order to make it difficult for the Spanish to repair it quickly. Now, all this activity would be done in a pitching and rolling sailing launch while being shot at with all kinds of weapons. Now, while Winslow and his men were cutting the cables, Commander McCullough would be supporting the operation with gunfire from the Marblehead and the Nashville. Oh, did I also mention the rough seas, coral reef bottom, and the cliffs right at the water's edge from where the entrenched Spanish could fire down on the men in the boats? I think the conspicuously and intrepid part of the requirements for the medal are fulfilled just on that alone. Now, the shore party would have 4 boats. 2 of them were steam cutters and 2 were sailing launches. Each steam cutter was manned by the regular crew of 5 men. That's a coxswain, 2 seamen, a fireman, and a coal passer. Now, in addition to the crew, a sergeant of Marines and a half-dozen privates were to go as sharpshooters. They were to be armed with rifles. In the Marblehead steam cutter, a 1-pound Hotchkiss cannon was to be mounted on the forecastle. The Nashville steam cutter was to have 2 Colt machine guns, 1 forward and 1 aft. All boats were to be supplied with life preservers, just in case they got swamped or blown up. I believe that fulfilled the risk of own life part of the requirements of the medal. Now, for each sailing launch, they were pulled by 12 oarsmen. The crew, therefore, consisted of 12 men and a coxswain. Now, the only men additional to the crew were to be the blacksmith and carpenter's mate, making with the officer in the boat 16 men in all. Half of them were to be armed with revolvers and the other half with rifles. Reason why? Well, in the event of the boat stranding accidentally, meaning the boats crashed on the breakers or they were overturned, and the men would have to fight to the last man on the shores against the Spaniards. Now, Winslow believed more effective work could be done with revolvers than rifles at such close quarters if that happened where they had to crash onto the beach. Now, a few extra rifles were put in the boats and ample supply of ammunition. Now, even though the force was inadequately armed and equipped to do the job, Lieutenant Winslow stated that there was no shortage of volunteers. Now, he did say he did have to replace a few men who were not physically up for the assignment. Interestingly enough, Lieutenant Winslow allowed the men to dress as they pleased, except for 2 major requirements. No white clothing, because that would draw enemy fire, and shoes must be worn in case of capsizing in the ocean. The bottom had sharp coral and would have cut their feet to ribbons. Now, I think Lieutenant Winslow made the point very clearly. There was a very good chance a large number of the men would die during this operation. Now, as you can see from the Google image, there was no real sandy beach where the shore party was going. It was rocks and cliffs, and the sea was running slightly rough. Now, the men in the sailing launch were going to have a difficult time keeping off the rocks while grappling for the cable. Then, once they had the cable, they would have a real difficult time keeping the launch from being swamped by the weight of the cable. Now, as I said before, these men did not have the correct equipment for this job. Now, ordinarily, a ship dedicated for the purpose of grappling underwater cables would have been used. This would allow the ship to stand far enough offshore so as not to expose the ship and the men to enemy fire. For the men in the cutters and the sailing launches, they headed into shallow waters where they could see the bottom and do the job of pulling up the cables. This would put the shore party directly under enemy fire. Now, to protect the men in the boats, the Nashville and the Marblehead also had to come in close to shore so those ships could bring their guns to bear on the shore batteries and the rifle pits. Okay, so it's early morning, May 11th. Now, it was hot as the sun was rising. The men turned out to board their boats. Winslow stated they were scantily and shabbily clothed. For the men in the boats, it was going to get even hotter. Now, the gunboat Nashville and the cruiser Marblehead were steaming into position. At 6:30, the Nashville's boats shoved off from the ship's side and headed for the Marblehead's boats. Now, the steam cutter would tow the sailing launches to within 150-200 yards of the shore. Any closer and the cutter risked grounding and breaking up on the coral reefs just below the surface of the water. Now, at 6:30 a.m. on the 11th, Winslow with his steam cutter and sailing launch from the Nashville, along with Lieutenant Anderson's steam cutter and sailing launches from the Marblehead, joined up. Lieutenant Winslow's final orders to his men was to cut the cable, and under no circumstances was his force to land on the shore. Now, at 6:45, Commander Maynard, in command of the Nashville, hoisted the signal ready. Captain McCalla and the Marblehead replied with 2 words: execute orders. The Nashville steamed slowly eastward, positioning itself 1,400 yards from the beach. The lighthouse bearing to the northward and westward. The boats of the cable-cutting party were under the shelter of the Nashville on the starboard side. Once the 2 ships were in position at 7:07, Captain McCalla gave the orders for the Marblehead to open fire. Nashville immediately followed. Both ships fired their main and secondary batteries at the shore defenses. The shore bombardment would continue until 10:30. As the bombardment started, Winslow and his group headed for shore. Within minutes of the bombardment, the cable house was in rubble. Whatever shore batteries the Spaniards had were out of commission, and the men in the barracks were either dead, wounded, or taking cover somewhere. That is, except for one brave soldier. Now, it's at this point that Lieutenant Winslow and Anderson transferred from the steam cutters to the sailing launches. Winslow left Ensign T.P. Magruder in command of both steam cutters with orders to keep his boats clear of the reefs, to fire on the rifle pits and hills, and to protect the working launches as much as possible. The shelling from the Marblehead and Nashville kept the shore defenses quiet. The steam launches approached the shore with the sailing launches in tow. The steam cutters also began firing when they were within effective range. And now, it was at this point that a cavalryman on horseback took off from the beach and galloped at top speed up one of the uneven surfaces of the paths and over the ridgeline. The sharpshooters in the steam cutters tried to stop him, but from the tossing and turning of the boats, their aim was inaccurate and he disappeared over the ridge. Reinforcements would soon be on their way. Now, when the boat party was opposite the cable house, the sailing launches were cast off from the steam cutters. With Ensign Magruder in charge, they took position about 150 to 200 yards from the beach and kept up continuous fire directed on the supposed positions of the enemy. The steam cutter from the Marblehead opened up with their 1-pound Hotchkiss bow gun as well as their 6 Marine sharpshooters. Now, the Nashville cutter opened up with their bow and stern Colt automatic machine guns as well as the armed Marine guards and sailors in the launch. Now, the steam cutters would provide constant covering fire during the operation. The sailing launches pulled into the shallow waters opposite the cable house. In his report, Lieutenant E.A. Anderson stated the first cable was quickly found in the shallow waters and, assisted by the Nashville's launch, was underrun out to 12 fathoms of water. Now, that's about 72 feet. and there a section the length of a boat was cut out of the cables. The operation to cut the first cable went smoothly. There was no gunfire from the Spanish defenders. This would change when they went after the second cable. So the Nashville sailing launch found the second cable about 60 yards offshore. Marblehead's launch came over. They grappled the second cable about 30 yards off of shore. So you had the two launches separated on the same cable. After the Marblehead launch cut the cable, the crew from the Nashville launch began to coil up about 100 feet of the cable and then cut their end, which they sank in about 36 feet of water. Now at this point, you need to understand what it took to cut these cables. They didn't use a regular bolt cutter from the machine shop on board ship and then snip jobs done. No, there was a little more involved with this operation. Now, to cut an underwater cable, it's not an easy or quick job, even when no one is firing at you. In this circumstances, it was deadly. The men in the launch had no protection. Lieutenant Winslow explained in detail how the job was accomplished. Quote, once the cable was hooked, it took the 30 men from both launches to laboriously lift the dingy and slimy object from the ocean bed 20 feet below. Now the heavy cable lay taut along the bottom and seemed to weigh tons as they tried to pull it up. Now as it was dragged to the surface, ropes were passed under it, and with heavers it was gradually worked over one corner of the stern of the boat, and then by sheer force was dragged into the boat and lifted over the rollers on the bow and the stern. Now the task of lifting it into the other boat was easier. Now after both boats were under the cable, one ahead of the other, the steam cutters took tow lines from the leading boat and went ahead at full speed. Now the men in the launches, by heavy hauling and the assistance of the steam cutters, slowly underran the cable. Now this cable was laid in a southerly direction until a depth of about 12 feet. That's 2 fathoms. Now when they reached that, then the direction was changed sharply to the eastward and followed the line of the reef. Now it was at this point that the Nashville's launch stopped and began cutting the cable. Axes and cold chisels were tried, but the hacksaw, that's a small handheld saw about 9 inches in length used for cutting metal, was found to be the most effective. By frequently changing the men using the hacksaw, the cable was cut through in about 20 to 30 minutes. Now the cable cutting party was able to cut through that first cable without being shot at too much. The second cable, well, that was when things started to go south. Do you remember that lone cavalryman that escaped off the beach? Well, that man managed to bring back reinforcements. That 30 minutes cutting the first cable was enough time for the Spaniards to get reinforcements out to the lighthouse and the rifle pits. The Spaniards were creeping through the chaparral, occupying the trenches in the lighthouse and extending their firing line along the ridge and down the slopes. They took their position skillfully and with courage. Okay, so as the men in the launch began cutting that second cable, the enemy opened fire on their launches. Now the guys in the launches did return fire, but those were only the ones who weren't engaged in cutting the cable. At first the fire was intermittent. Now the fire from the sailing launches and the steam cutters, as well as the continuous heavy fire maintained by the Marblehead and the Nashville, they were able to keep the Spaniards' return fire to a minimum. And it was while the men were working on the second cable that they noticed a third smaller cable running parallel. They deduced that this cable wasn't connecting it to the outside world, but they decided to grapple the third one and cut it anyways. Now, as the men were grappling the third smaller cable, the enemy forces had greatly increased and poured deadly fire down into those launches. Because the Spaniards were using smokeless powder, it was hard for the Americans to accurately target the Spanish positions. Now, Lieutenant Winslow wrote in Century magazine, "It was at this point I stood up in the boat and made a rapid survey of the situation. Anderson and his men were still working hard in their boat a little to the seaward of the Nashville. Just then I saw a Marine in the Marblehead steam cutter fall, shot through the head. Now turning in the direction of Anderson's boat, I saw one of the men drop, struck by a Mauser bullet. And then as I faced the shore to look at the trenches, Seaman Robert Bull, standing in the stern sheets of my boat, collapsed, then struggling to his feet and immediately sank in the bottom of the boat. A gaping wound 6 inches long in his head, 2 bullet holes through his body, and a bullet in his shoulder, probably the result of machine gun fire." The Marine that Lieutenant Winslow mentioned was Private Herman Kirchmeister. He was on the Marblehead, I believe, and he related what happened during the cutting of the cables when he would give talks to high school students. He said, "The lifting of the cable was a very perilous and laborious task, but the cutting crew went about their job coolly. Bullets were piercing the boat, and the water was coming in. But coolly as ever, we put a bullet in the hole, and it helped keep the water out. Large shells dropped around us, nearly lifting us out of the water. Shells from our own ship and the Spanish batteries passed overhead. Up to this time, only a few in the boat suffered slight wounds to the arm or hand. Such we did not mind. Our main thought was to aim good and keep cool. But at this time, the whole Santa Clara Regiment advanced in a company as on parade. This was very dangerous to us, but we determined to try our last hope. I grasped our ensign floating on the stern and signaled, quote, 'They are the coming of the enemy,' end quote, to the Marblehead, who in a few minutes began to shell the lines, demoralizing the Spanish regiment. We received fire from another direction that began to take its toll on our members. We seemed lost. Our wounded were growing fast in number, 1 killed in our boat and 7 in the cutting boat. Then, with relief, the last cable was hoisted and cut. A shower of bullets came again, and one glanced along the left side of my face, and a second hit in the same spot, taking part of the jawbone and teeth, and a piece off the tongue and the back part of my mouth. It came out behind the ear within a 16th of an inch of the jugular vein. One of my teeth was driven into my neck, where it remained until September 13th, when it was removed at the Brooklyn Navy Hospital. The only thing I remember after being brought aboard ship is that I insisted that I was able to walk to the operating table. As I lay in the captain's cabin, it came to me. If I died, it was for my country and a glorious cause. The fire had become so intense and deadly, Lieutenant Winslow ordered the sailing launches to let go of the third cable and ordered the steam cutters to take the sailing launches in tow. Now, the sailors in the launches began pulling for their very lives. They had 2 problems, though. One was the hail of lead raining down on them from the Spaniards up on the cliffs, and the other problem was keeping the boat clear of the breakers until the steam cutters could effectively get them under tow. Now, Winslow continued, "At the same time we opened fire from the men in the sailing launches, not at the oars, the steam cutters kept up their fire. We continued firing while in retreat and under heavy fire from the enemy, our men displaying great coolness. Shortly after my launch was taken in tow, while I was reaching for a fresh rifle, I was struck by an enemy's ball in my left hand, but was not crippled, and I was able to continue in command. Now, we steamed as rapidly as possible against a head sea for the Marblehead and the Nashville, keeping up our fire as we retreated. One man in my boat, Robert Velez, seaman, was shot in the head and badly injured. Now, the Marblehead's boat, though farther from the beach than the Nashville's, suffered more losses. Now, in Lieutenant Anderson's launch, things were getting serious. In his official report, he stated, "The enemy, who had taken a position within 150 yards of the water, opened up on the boat with volley fire. One man in the launch was badly wounded at the first volley, and having been ordered by Lieutenant Winslow to cast off, the cable was slipped and the launch started to return the enemy fire, who were evidently in force. They fired rapidly at the boats with rifle and machine guns and some shells that fell near the launch. I should judge they were using basically 1-pounders. Now, the coxswain, having been wounded, just as the launch got started, I steered the boat off and directed the crew to keep down between the thwarts as much as possible." Basically, in other words, the men were rowing bent over. Now, in spite of this precaution, 3 more men were wounded, the bullets penetrating the sides of the boat. Owing to the bullet holes in the launch, she was making water freely while going off, requiring constant bailing. Now, the Nashville and Marblehead were close to shore and also received enemy fire. The captain of the Nashville, Commander Maynard, reported, "I cannot praise too highly the coolness and good behavior of all on board, officers and men. Lieutenant C. Dillingham, the executive officer, deserves great credit for his coolness and good judgment throughout the affair, and especially towards the close of the engagement, when the commanding officer, being temporarily disabled by a shock caused by being struck over the heart by a rifle bullet, Now, he handled the ship and boats admirably. Okay, so by 1013, the cutters and the launches were alongside the Nashville as a signal was sent to the Marblehead that the cables had been cut. The cost of this operation was 7 men shot. Okay, so why 52 Medal of Honors for this one action? Well, the Navy instituted an application process for the Medal of Honor in July 1862 and made the recommendation of a commanding officer mandatory. Now, the reason why these 52 Medal of Honor awards were approved was because at that time, this was the only decoration the Navy could offer to enlisted men, so it had to be applied to a broad range of heroic sacrifices made in combat and peacetime by members of the naval service. Now, the award citation for each recipient is worded exactly the same way. For example, Landsman John P. Riley's citation read, "On board the USS Nashville during the operation of cutting the cables leading from Cienfuegos, Cuba, 11 May 1898, facing heavy fire from the enemy, Riley displayed extraordinary bravery and coolness throughout this action." Now, Marine Private Daniel J. Campbell's citation read, "On board the USS Marblehead during the cutting of the cables leading from Cienfuegos, Cuba, 11 May 1898, facing heavy fire of the enemy, Campbell set an example of extraordinary bravery and coolness throughout this action." Now, it did not matter if you were a sailor or a Marine or if you were from the Marblehead or the Nashville. The acts of the 52 men on the cable-cutting party were considered examples of extraordinary bravery and coolness throughout the action, which at that time was considered action worthy of a Medal of Honor. Now, interestingly though, the officers who led the mission were not eligible for the medal. At that time, it was only awarded to the enlisted ranks. It wouldn't be until March 3rd, 1915, the Navy and Marine Corps officers were eligible for the Medal of Honor. Army officers, on the other hand, were eligible for the award in 1863. Now, an interesting side note here, Lieutenant Anderson actually was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1915 for action at Veracruz when the Marines landed there. Anyways, these men were in what was ostensibly a large, overgrown 12-man rowboat 150 yards from heavy enemy fire. There was no place to take cover, and jumping out of the boats and swimming for safety was not an option. Anyways, this is an interesting piece of American history that I thought you would enjoy. So, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories from our past. Also, what part did you find interesting? Let me know in the comments section below, or if you have a question about the subject, hey, put the question in the comments. I'll answer it. Now, it'd be great if you could share this video with your friends who also like history. Thank you for watching.